Hello, my name is Juana Gallegos, and today I will be talking about the reading reflections for Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. The first chapter is Chapter 7, and it's called Students with Learning Disabilities. In this chapter, I learned a lot of the characteristics of the learning of students with learning disabilities, and the ones that are mentioned in this chapter are reading disabilities that are also synonymous to dyslexia, math and academic, and also memory and emotional. But within these characteristics, the one that stood out for me was emotional, because it actually does mention that how students with disabilities do suffer from depression and anxiety due to their disabilities. And I think that's really important for teachers, parents, and other services members to understand that these students do suffer emotionally as well. But then the causes of students that have learning disabilities, it is based on neurological, genetics, and environmental causes. Within the understanding how students with disabilities are evaluated, one intervention that stood out for me was the response to intervention model. This intervention, also known as RTI, it's basically research-based intervention, and it's based on 3 tiers, which is based on the level of the student. If the student is dealing with more behaviors and with more intense services, we moved into other tiers. Basically, this model is that it helps determine the presence of the learning disability, and I think it's a really useful one because it does base it, but then first trying the first tier, seeing how it goes, and then they go on forward to the second and then the third, and that's how they see what type of needs the student needs and requires. Then my experiences that I related with this chapter is the inclusion tips that they mention. In the chapter, the inclusion tips are based on behavior, social interaction, educational, and classroom attitude. I think that's a really key point to understand, because in the classroom, behavior and social interactions with the students are very important to understand when they are given an opportunity to socialize with their general educational classmates. And I think that's really important because most importantly, teachers must also understand class management and how to deal with all the students so they can all be respectful and also interact. And finally, within this chapter, something that stood out for me was I always struggled to understand how you would educate a student with special needs, and especially with reading. I always wonder, how are we going to teach students that need help with reading? And in this chapter, it talks about the Orton-Gillingham approach, and it emphasizes on instruction and multisensory methods, which I think is really important. It basically focuses on phonemic awareness, morphemes, and the sounds. And it is also inspired by the 8 tiers method, which is first, second, and third. This approach is most recently developed, and it's basically also developed for students not only for elementary but also post-secondary. And they are making a lot of progress, and I think it's really important for teachers to learn about this method and continue to see how they can progress with their students as well. Following this, Chapter 8, called Students with Speech and Language Disorders. This chapter starts off with defining each disorder, which is speech disorder, language disorder, receptive and expressive language disorder. And there is a difference between language and speech. Speech disorder refers to the difficulty of producing sounds, and language consists of the difficulty of receiving and understanding and formulating the ideas. So similar to speech, receptive disorder is difficulty receiving and understanding information, and expressive is difficulty formulating ideas and information. Within the speech disorder, there were 2 that stood out for me that emphasize what speech disorder consists, and it's called articulation disorder and apraxia. Articulation disorder is when the child cannot produce various sounds and make sound combinations of speech. And apraxia is more about the motor speech disorder that affects the way the student plans how to produce speech. So these students have difficulty in making purposeful movements of their speech, as in with their mouth and sounds. Following this, the language disorders are basically on the emphasis of phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Each one is very different, but they basically combine when students have a disorder that they are unable to discriminate the differences between speech sounds and sound segments. They have problems using the structure of word to get. They also struggle with ordering words, and they also struggle with using words together and using it in a as a social use of language. The causes for students with speech language disorders can be based on biological, as in within their neuromuscular mechanism, and also environmental. But in the chapter, they didn't really emphasize what type of environmental causes they are given, so it's currently unknown. Within my experiences, I work as a student with students with special needs, particularly with students with autism as an instructional assistant, and I do see how students do struggle with formulating words. I have seen students have the opportunity to use assistive language, and I've also accompanied them when they go into with their speech and language pathologist. And it's interesting to learn that each student is very different in what type of disorder they need and what type of needs they need. So it's really important, and I feel that teachers, speech pathologists, and the parents do collaborate in understanding what the student needs, so that they use all the environment that the child is in the setting to help the student develop and progress in their speech and language. And finally, within the chapter, something that actually stood out for me was they mentioned how to include students with speech and language disorders, and the importance of this is that they include them in inclusion practices, because this provides them to have a natural and meaningful context, and it also provides an opportunity for their intervention and assessment, and they don't feel like they're being tested. It just happens naturally, and they make the progress in a more meaningful way. Overall, this is what I learned in these 2 chapters, and thank you so much for listening.